For today, we're going to be looking not at a text exactly, but at a formulation that was given by the Buddha himself in the early teachings. It's known as the triple wisdom, and it's made up of three words: Shruta, Chinta, and Bhavana. And Shruta means hearing with the ear. Chinta refers to pondering or meditating, contemplating in the heart. And bhavana literally means becoming, but it's an embodied becoming. And so we can think of it as being practice or practice with the body. So hearing with the ear, pondering in the heart, and practicing with the body. And the Buddha said that these are the three stages that we have to go through in order to put his teachings into practice. And the danger being that if we stop at either the first or the second stage and don't make it through to the third, the practice with the body, then in fact those teachings are not going to make any difference. So what we're sort of faced with here is the warning against what we might proverbially call the armchair Buddhism. And this is certainly an affliction that can afflict many of us, that we become so embroiled and fascinated by the Buddha's teachings, about the commentaries, about, higher truths and so forth, that it all goes up into the head instead of coming down into the body. So it's useful as a reminder that, in fact, study and practice of Buddhism really do have to go hand in hand. These are the, if you like, the two legs on which the whole edifice of Buddhism walks. And so we'll have a little look at, so we're just going to have a look at some points around this, and particularly we're going to concentrate on practice, obviously. But to begin with, we'll look at Shruta. Shruta sort of shares a root that means to hear. It refers to hearing, and the term Shravakas, which refers to those who hear the Buddha's teachings. Those of you who know your Mahayana will know that Shravakas are referred to, for example, in the Lotus Sutra. It's the early beginning stage of coming into contact with the Buddha's teaching, and this is where the heart is open. It's looking for something. And it's open enough to take in something of the Buddha's teachings and for them to resonate in the heart as such. And we might also call this reading with the eye as well, because this really is just about listening to Dharma talks like this, or reading books or articles on Buddhism. Perhaps we could say watching videos on YouTube or something like that. But of course, if it just becomes repetitive, as it were, it becomes something that we become stimulated by, without it ever going on to produce any real change in our lives. In a way, it's a form of promiscuity. We could almost say it's a form, and in fact, it might sound weird to say this, but I think there are parallels with pornography. Here it can become something that gives us a stimulation quickly, but in the end doesn't really lead to any transformation, any changes in life. If sexual lust doesn't become some form of romantic love and ideal love, and then ultimately love of the divine, whatever way or shape or form that means something to us, then that transformation of that instinct that's to something much more humanized doesn't take place. This is something that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, referred to as the development of eros, or the principle of eros, which can be sexual desire, can be romantic love, can be idealism, and then also love of the divine, or love of the transcendent, love of the immanent, as well, the divine in all things. Perhaps we would refer to it as the realization of the aspiration to Buddhahood, realization of the Buddha nature, the bodhicitta. So is a very important stage, but it cannot just remain there. In order to fulfill itself, it has to move on. And so the next stage is Chinta, which refers to a form of meditation or contemplation. This is a reflection on, and we could also call it pondering, rather than thinking about it. This is pondering refers in particular when we recognize the truth of the teachings to us in our own lives, that we recognize, for example, the truth of the Four Noble Truths, that perhaps, the way out of unhappiness is not going out to acquire things, transient pleasures that satisfy us for a short period of time, that then grow dull, and then we start looking for something else, and it becomes a repetitive cycle. This is the wheel of life. But we perhaps realise that it is this constant wanting and then disappointment, and wanting and dullness, and then wanting again, and so forth. This constant repetition itself that is the problem. And this is what the Buddha outlined in his Four Noble Truths, his diagnosis of human suffering and the way out of it. And so when we are able to marry up those teachings to our own experience in some way, even in some small way, then we can move on to the next stage, which is bhavana. And bhavana literally means becoming, and it is that view where something has truly moved us to the point that we do something about it. We've decided, yes, this is it, and we start taking our first footsteps. And it's very easy, as has already been pointed out, it's very easy for us to fall by the wayside. And I remember, perhaps fall by the wayside is not always the case, but we never set out to become a Buddhist, but we were interested in Buddhism, and we can even make it our livelihood. I remember once a very famous professor came and giving a talk on Buddhism, on an aspect of Buddhism. Brilliant talk, really, really good. And afterwards, someone asked him, "How long have you been a Buddhist, Professor?" And he said, "What?" He said, "I've never been a Buddhist." And some of us were quite shocked, because all of us had been brought up with the Shruta Chinta Bhavana, that the whole point of Buddhism was not to study, or not only to study, but to practice what we had learned as well. But there you go. He'd made he was a very eminent person, had made a name for himself in his field. He was a real expert, and had made good living out of it as well. So I guess it can have its returns, obviously. However, it's not what the Buddha had in mind when he gave his teachings. They are to run through this triple wisdom, Shruta, Chinta, and then Bhavana, so that they become fulfilled. So, moving on to then that sort of practice with the body, we talk about meditation practice, obviously, which is part of it, chanting practice as well, which is part of it, making offerings to the Buddha of incense, light and flowers and so forth, setting up a shrine. This is all part of the practice. This is the practice of devotion, and devotion is extremely important, both for monastics and for lay people. It forms a very important plank in Buddhist practice in Buddhist countries, and always has done. Meditation is obviously important too. Sitting meditation, and obviously sitting meditations, people are very interested in that here in the West, obviously, sometimes a little bit to the negligence of everything else as well. Because we have to remember that meditation also has to be accompanied by the ethical side, that's the precepts and the discipline as well, and the cultivation and development of wisdom. That's the clear seeing that comes as the fruit of the practice, and then also enhances the practice moving forward as well. So that's important too. Then there's obviously the everyday practice, what we call daily life practice, giving ourselves wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. And when the heart strays, or our attention goes off into thoughts of me and mine, and what I like and what I don't like, then quickly as possible to bring it back and to give ourselves once more wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. And sometimes this is called mindfulness practice too, but we tend to call it daily life practice, to remind us that it's not something that is just done on occasion. We don't occasionally practice mindfulness. The ideal is to practice it 24/7, though it has to be said, as my own late teacher used to say, only a fully fledged Buddha can bring it off 24/7. However, it shouldn't stop us at least applying ourselves with that in mind, given that the promise is that all beings will attain Buddhahood at some point anyway. But there are some useful devices that we can apply, and some things we can really learn to see how this daily life practice can become, a path towards excellence, or a path towards making something perfect. And this is what somebody does when they develop skill to a very, very high level. Now, Trevor Leggett, the late Trevor Leggett, once told a story. He was a great collector of stories. He was a great judo man. He was Olympic champion, but he trained in Japan for many, many years in a very traditional dojo, or number of dojos, and then was one of the main pioneers of bringing judo to the UK. And if you look him up, he's got lots of books, some really good books on stories, training stories, which is one thing he was very keen on. And he was always very keen on getting his judo students to apply the principles of judo that they learn in the dojo out in their ordinary daily lives as well. Not necessarily practicing judo on passers-by, that's not what I meant, but the principles, the discipline that is fashioned in the dojo. He was very keen that that discipline should be taken out into our daily life, and we should cultivate the same attitude of really becoming fine, cultivated, but also very skilled in living as well, and that the principles that you learn in the dojo can be taken out. They apply to life. They're life lessons, not just in the dojo, not just for judo. But he tells the story of so he was probably in the 1950s. One day, a chap approached him who was a debt collector in the East End of London, and this guy had quite a dangerous job, often involving quite a lot of conflict, and he was a very busy man. He was a family man, and he said, "Look, I haven't got time to, come here and learn judo properly, but can you show me something to help me?" And at first, Trevor Leggett said no. He said, "This is a whole discipline. You come and do the whole thing." But he really said, he really made the point that he was unable to. It wasn't that he was, shy. And so Trevor Leggett relented and said, "Okay, I will show you this one thing." And so he showed him one move, and he got the man to practice it, and again and again, and until he was satisfied that he was reasonably competent with it. And then he said to him, "You must practice this move every single day for 15 to 20 minutes, every single day, without fail." And he said, "Come back in a week and I'll see how it is then." So he came back in a week, he made a few corrections, then sent him off and said, "Right, that's it. You just keep practicing, remember what I said." And that was it. He never saw the man again. And then towards the end of his career, after he'd set up, a number of his own students had set up their own dojos. One day he was visiting one of them when a young man approached him and said, "You don't know me, but you know my father." He was the debt collector. And when I told him that I was taking up judo, he said, "Well, if you ever run into Mr. Leggett," he said, "would you give him a message?" And the boy turned to Trevor Leggett and said, and the message was, "It worked." And Trevor Leggett used to tell that story because he really wanted to make that point, that this is a useful thing that we can approach our practice with. And even in the spiritual practices, there are similar accounts as well. I think it's St. Therese de Lisieux who used to practice the perfection of closing doors. That she would close them with the whole love of God in her heart. As if she, like she was handling or holding the Christ child, for example, as she closed the door. And that, having those markers, those little oases during the day, those little islands, provide us with a mnemonic, something to remind us of the practice, which is often one of the main reasons that people cite for not really doing the practice, is that people simply forget to do it. They get so carried away. But having those things and perfecting them is really good. And again, the story of the young novitiate who asked the abbot for something that he can use throughout the whole of his training, and the abbot says two things: always say yes to everything. Obviously he's in a monastic environment, you say yes to to what has to be done, and the other is always walk noiselessly. And that's a really useful thing. I mean, it really takes you all the way through, because when we become upset or disturbed about something, when we become impassioned about something, it's easy to notice that not just walking noiselessly, but being quiet we forget, don't we? We stomp around, we can slam doors, we can shout, we bump into things or knock things over and they clatter around. Or if we're eating and we're hungry, bang, 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 bang with the knife and fork on the plate. That's something that's really noticeable on retreats, on sessions, in food, because food becomes, a really important thing when we're on sessions, because it's something we can disport ourselves with. And this is known, and this is why in the dining room the discipline is particularly strict, and not making a noise, scraping chairs, or again bumping into things, or taking more food than we're going to eat as well, which could also happen because the eyes are bigger than the stomach, but then also making a lot of noise in the process of eating, because we've carried away. I am carried away. And so that's the moment that we practice the restraint. And it's the perfection there that really makes that difference. And this is something, when it's done well and it's done properly, then the skill can become divine. And really in no small, measure do I mean that. It really can. If you listen to, say a classical musician, you can have a classical musician who technically is really good, but if their heart hasn't been wholly given into it, there's something missing in the performance. It's like the spirit of it isn't there. This sort of spirit which is, you can't, it's almost intangible, but we know it when we see it, or we know it when we hear it. But someone who has that excellence lifts, and the audience is lifted simultaneously, and there's that communication heart to heart between the musician and the hearers, that there's that real resonance that is above and beyond just the technical capability, and that's where that sort of perfection, that divinity, that divine essence, if you like, is then carried over. And I remember our good friend Roberta Mansell, who illustrated the Lotus Sutra, tells us, because she obviously knew she went on various things with other people who were practicing forms of illustration or religion or illumination, and she told me the story of someone who was practicing. I think this person was a European, but they were studying Chinese brush and ink drawing, and she told me that her training, this woman's training, again very traditional, was so she already was an artist when she took Chinese brush and ink painting up. And her teacher said, okay, I just want you to draw a leaf, and it's 3 strokes. There's the central stem, and then there's the right and then the left edges of the leaf. They're just 3 strokes. And she drew it onto a piece of paper and got her student to draw it. And she drew some, and she said, painted some, or brushed some. And she said, no, you see this line is too thick, or it's not quite right. And she, eventually she got it right, after filling a page or two. And then she said to her, right, go away and practice this every single day and come back in a month. So she did. She came back in a month, and the teacher said, okay, now just draw the leaf again. She drew the leaf. She said, okay, but you can see that, and she corrected her again a few more times until she got it right, and then sent her away for another month. I told her to come back again. The same thing happened. This went on for 6 months until finally the teacher said, yes, you've got it. And the student said, my God, she said, I went through every emotion in the book. She said, every single emotion. I thought, my God, I can't even draw a leaf now. It's taken me 6 months to draw a leaf. What about when we get onto the bamboo? What about when we get onto the rocks? What about, all the other things I'm supposed to be able to, which is all part of it. But the teacher said to her, she said, well, what you're doing is not really just learning to draw a leaf. You're actually learning to overcome yourself. The point is that if I were to burst into your bedroom at 3 o'clock in the morning, shake you awake, stick a brush in your hand and say, draw a leaf, even with your eyes closed, she said, that brush would draw that leaf perfectly in all circumstances. You may have just had a row, you may be upset by something, you may be excited about something that's coming up, but you will be wholeheartedly in that. You will be able to let go of all that and give yourself into this. Once you've learned to do that, she said, then the rest is just technical expertise, and that can be taught relatively quickly. Really good lesson that, that skill, we may be practicing the skill, but the skill itself, as it develops, is transforming us in the process. There is this relationship, this two-way relationship. As we give our heart into the doing of this, then the doing itself reciprocates. And this is, again, what Miyake used to like to say. I look at the flower and the flower looks at me. If we really give ourselves into what at this moment is being done, then that response comes back quite naturally, and it changes us. And I want to just finish by reading out a story, actually, from a book I'm currently reading called The Shadow Book of Ji Yun, which is edited and translated by Yi Izzy Yu and John Yu Branscombe. And Ji Yun was an 18th century Chinese poet and also a scholar, and he happened to be the curator of the Imperial Library. So he was under the patronage, obviously, of the Emperor of China himself. And he had a real fascination with stories of the peculiar, the supernatural, the strange, and just those stories that are somewhat anomalous and can't even be properly categorized. And he used to collect them, and in fact he collected 5 volumes of these stories, and there's this book, The Shadow Book of Ji Yun, is a translation of some of those stories. But I came across a really interesting example that I think illustrates this very much. It's the story is called A Thing Done in a Moment, and I'll just read it out straight. A rash of tiger attacks plagued Jingde County, while my cousin Ji Zhonghan was magistrate there. The attacks were so bloody, brutal, and continual that the residents were sure that a pack was behind the violence, until the evidence of hairs and tracks determined that, no, a single animal was responsible. After that, the county's hunters tried to trap the clever beast or kill it with an assortment of weapons. Most could not find it, or at least claimed they couldn't, and the few that did get close were maimed or massacred. Finally, a group of citizens demanded that my cousin hire the service of the Tangs, the famous tiger hunting family from Huizhou. He agreed and dispatched a servant with a high fee that the Tangs charged. A few days later, the servant returned with the news that the Tangs had agreed to take on the task and that 2 of their best men would arrive soon. The Tang family's speciality began during the Ming dynasty, when a tiger killed a Tang man, shortly before the birth of his son. The distraught mother swore revenge and found the best hunters in her province to train her son to kill tigers. She swore to him that if he did not devote his life to doing so, then she would disown him. This same vow had been made by the son and his wife to their children, and so on until the Tangs became what they were. The residents waited with great anticipation for the Tang hunters. They were eager to be free of their fear, but also curious about what kind of men that generations of such single-minded breeding produced. They conjured images of black-bearded brutes, thick-bodied like hunters in old paintings, massive hands wrapped around guns designed for big game. Then the actual tiger hunters turned up and everyone's hearts fell. No thick bones, no black beards, no guns. What their money had bought was an old man with a white beard, a bad cough and a short-handled axe, and a vacant-looking youth of around 16 or 17 years, with arms barely thicker than bamboo. My cousin reddened when he saw the pair, and he was stiff and silent as they announced their identities. But, despite his near certainty that the Tangs were playing a practical joke, he decided to treat the hunters seriously until he saw what they could do, and called out for food and drink. The old man, discerning my cousin's scepticism, waved away the offer. "Hold off," he said. "There's nothing yet to celebrate. Feasting can wait until we see to this tiger of yours." A guide escorted the ungainly pair to where the tiger had last been seen, a steaming valley at the bottom of a steep path near the county border. At the top of the path, the guide halted. "This is as far as I go." Laughing, the old man patted the guide's arm. "What?" he said. "You don't trust us to protect you?" He then motioned the distracted-looking boy to his side, and the pair descended into the valley. Near the bottom, the old man stopped the boy. "The beast must be sleeping," he said. "Call it." Hunched over, the boy thrust up his chin, spreading his mouth wide, and let loose from his scrawny body a startling imitation of a tiger's roar. One roar, two. The boy did not have to make a third, because halfway through the second, the tiger bounded out. Roaring itself with eyes and teeth flashing and moving forward so fast that it seemed thrown in anger, the tiger headed straight for the old man. It seemed certain that the tiger would tear him into blood and guts. But just as the tiger leapt, the old man ducked and rolled onto his back, his axe held tightly in one hand as he gracefully dodged the massive paws. When the tiger landed, blood and ichor dumped from its belly, and it crashed to the ground dead. The guide realized that just as the tiger sailed over, the old man and his tiny axe had sliced it open from throat to tail. The celebration that night was wild with applause and cheers. Towards the end of the meal, someone asked the odd hunters how they managed to accomplish killing a tiger so quickly. The old man stopped eating and said, "I did not kill the tiger just like that. It might have appeared to take just a moment, but my part took me a lifetime to learn. First I had to spend 10 years strengthening the arm that held the axe, so that a man could swing from my arm without unsteadying it. Then another 10 years to hone my eyes, so that they could track the fall of individual raindrops and resist blinking, even if tickled with a feather." My cousin's account of the two men and the tiger bears witness to the truth of the philosopher Zhuangzi's observation that innate talent counts for little in life. Intelligent, strong, and gifted people are born all the time whose attributes never bear fruit, or who never contribute anything to the world. It is not innate talent, but practice that nurtures the superhuman. It is fidelity and dedication that enables the impossible. Once I saw the scholar Shi Sibao write a long line of poetry in the dark with his brush. His fine writing style was no different in the dark than it was in the light, which is more than can be said for most people. Even more impressively, I was told that Li Wenkei, former vice head of the Department of Penalties and Justice, can repeatedly write the same character on 100 separate pieces of very thin paper with such precision that each character is exactly the same, with no deviation of any stroke. He does this so perfectly that when he stacks the pieces of paper and holds the stack up to the sun, the light shines through and makes it seem as if a single character is floating in midair. The only trick in all these cases is humility and faith enough to devote yourself to one small thing. How accomplished one could be if one modestly focused on just one thing and never let off until the performance was perfect. This is how the mundane becomes the divine.